stories in the Bible teach me about the important things in life. They show me what true life is, and they show me the way of eternal life through Jesus. These stories remind me, and all of us, of course, that we are not alone. That not only God is with us, but that we belong to a people of God who we travel through life with and who try to live by the same stories that I do and share in the same meaning and hope that these Bible stories bring to us. And of course, many of the stories in the Bible are journey stories where people go on actual physical journeys. Journeys of men and women, journeys of young people, journeys where children are included too. And this morning we start a new series called Next Steps. Next Steps, responding to God in faith. Next Steps, responding to God in faith. And my prayer is that as we look at these journeys, and as we encounter afresh the God who leads people on journeys, that these stories and the God who is behind them might seep into our consciousness, would grip our minds, move in our hearts, and direct our hands and our feet as we take part in God's great plan for this world. Before Easter, we had a series on journeying with Jesus. We looked at 10 chapters in Luke's Gospel, and we journeyed with Jesus as he set his face towards Jerusalem. And in the encounters that he had, and the things that he taught as he went to his death. Next Steps, responding to God in faith, is our new series. And this morning we'll be traveling with Abraham and Sarah, a married couple who lived about 4,000 years ago. Isn't it wonderful that we can go back about 4,000 years and be influenced by a journey or journeys that happened back then? Of course, we look to Abraham and Sarah as being the people that are like sort of the patriarch and matriarch in the faith. They are our spiritual ancestors through whom God worked, and it was from their descendants who became the Jewish people. And their influence has gone down through the generations. So Abraham and Sarah, where did they come from? Well, they came from what is now southern Iraq. And they came from a city called Ur. This is a representation, or these are representations of the city of Ur, perhaps from a later time than Abraham and Sarah lived, but nevertheless, it was a significant city, a significant civilization, and it was from an area of the world that was very rich and fertile because it was Mesopotamia, that is, the region between the two great rivers in that part of the world, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. And it was Abraham's father who led them to travel from Ur to another city, which is in modern day Turkey, the city of Haran. And we see here Abraham and Sarah's journey and all those that accompanied them. You'll see Ur there down near the Red Sea, and coming up towards Babylon, and then on to Haran up the top there. And so the Lord spoke to Abraham in Haran. And God called Abraham and Sarah to do a hard thing. That is, to leave their family and home and move to another country, although they didn't know what country they would be going to. For Abraham and Sarah, this would mean a journey to the land of Canaan and many years of a Bedouin type existence. Living in these great tents and with their flocks, their herds, and constantly on the move, looking for pastures, looking for water. And so this is what the call meant for them. So they were right away from the comfort of what they originally knew in Ur and also Haran. And God called them to travel, but they didn't know the destination. Many in this congregation know from their own experience that to leave home and family and country is not an easy thing to do. I remember stories of my own parents told. They migrated to Australia in 1952. It was under the immigration scheme. I think it cost £10 per person, and I think the name given to all those that came at that time were £10 poms. But they never liked that because they were Scots, and that was a bit of an insult. But they believed that they were led by God to come to Australia. My mum and dad were involved. They lived in London, and they were city missionaries with the London City Mission, living and working in inner city London amongst London's poor. But they caught that ship. God had called them. They took my brother and sister with them. I wasn't on the scene at that stage. And they came to Queensland, where my father had been called to be a pastor. So they arrived at the docks in Brisbane, and they were met by a farmer of the church that they were going to on the Darling Downs in Queensland, not all that far from Toowoomba, a little town of about 1,000 people called Allara. And they were picked up in a utility. And so they went out to Toowoomba and then on to Allara. And my father came to pastor that little church there. But they talked about the culture shock of moving from London, inner city London, to this little town in Queensland. Of moving to a place where they spoke a strange dialect of English, of great homesickness in the first couple of years. But they had responded to the call of God. And where God calls, He enables. When God calls, He provides. And God even provided a beautiful baby boy. by the name of John. What happened, you might say? What happened? But you know, Sarah and Abraham's experience was different to most migration experiences in that they didn't know where they were going. And in Hebrews we read, by an act of faith, Abraham said yes to God's call to travel to an unknown place that would become his home when he left. He had no idea where he was going. By an act of faith, he lived in the country promised him, living as a stranger, camping in tents. That's the Message translation from Eugene Peterson. This was Abraham and Sarah, believing God, stepping out in faith, hearing the call of God and responding. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German Christian and theologian who opposed Adolf Hitler, once said, we must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. We must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. Abraham and Sarah could have stayed in Haran. It seems they had all that they needed in terms of material possessions and so forth. But they allowed themselves to be interrupted by God. When was the last time that God interrupted your life? You might have had plans for the short or medium or long terms, but God said to you, no, I've got something else for you. How did you respond at that time? Was it by hearing and believing and in obedience? Another question to ask ourselves is, how open am I to what God has for me? And likewise, a good question for us as a congregation is, how open are we to what God has for us? Let's move on in the story of Abraham and Sarah, because there is really important context to God's call to them. God just didn't say to them, all right, Abraham and Sarah, I'm calling you, off you go. There was much more to it than that. We saw that in the Bible reading this morning. The call came with a promise. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. And not only that, all the peoples on earth will be blessed by you. God made a covenant with Abraham and gave that wonderful promise. Not only would he be blessed and his descendants be blessed and become a great nation, but that all the world would be blessed through him. And to me, this is quite extraordinary, because in the ancient Middle East, there was a constant movement of extended families and clans and tribes and people groups looking for better land, looking for better opportunities. But here is something more, much, much more. Because God is saying, Abraham and Sarah, it's not only you and your descendants who will be blessed, but all the peoples on earth. And you know, that's the thing with God and his plans. They are so much wider and more magnificent than we could ever imagine. And he calls us to be a part of them. He has called each one of us to be disciples of Jesus Christ, to journey with Jesus through life. And as we respond in faith, we are caught up in something so much bigger than ourselves, in that we are a part of God's plan to bless our communities, to bless our nation, to bless the world. Sometimes when we walk the journey of faith and obedience, we see the results. It was the faithful action of a humble Romanian pastor by the name of Laszlo Tokes, which led to the downfall of the brutal communist regime in Romania in 1989. This is not something that this pastor had planned for. But when he became pastor in the city of Timisoara in 1987, he faithfully preached the gospel. He pastored the members of the flock. He discipled people. He encouraged people that the risen Christ was active and present among them. He evangelized. Many were converted, both young and old, and the church began to grow rapidly, and such was the impact and such was the spreading influence of this church that the secret police became concerned. Because in this dictatorship, this communist dictatorship, the leaders did not want to acknowledge any other authority in life apart from themselves. And so the secret police used all types of intimidation and tactics against this pastor and against members of the congregation. And one evening when the secret police arrived to evict him from the church property, the members of the congregation all flocked to the church where Pastor Tokes and his family also had their apartment. And they held up candles and they just sort of stood in front of the secret police. And then more and more saw what was happening and they flooded to the place. And so there's this big crowd developed holding up candles. And then over the next day or so, the demonstrations increased. There was much violence. Many were killed. Many were shot. But this led to the downfall of this communist regime. All because this pastor and this church stood up for what is right in faithful obedience to God. They would not bend the knee to the state that was demanding their ultimate loyalty. But you know, sometimes when we journey in faithful obedience, we don't see the results. We might never see the results and we might never know of them. But that's not the point. The point is we are a part of God's greater plan for the world through Jesus Christ. So how did Abraham and Sarah get on? Did they remain steadfast in faith? Was there immediate blessing? Was it a straightforward journey of faith for them where they trusted God at every step of the way? Well, no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't by any means. As they traveled through the land of Canaan, God promised them, I will give you this land to your offspring. But things didn't get off to a promising start because there was famine in the land. There was drought, and Abraham and Sarah and all who accompanied them with their flocks as well had to head off to Egypt where there was reliable water. They had to go there so that they could survive. And Abraham, fearful that the Pharaoh would kill him and take his beautiful wife Sarah as his own. Abraham at this point said to Pharaoh, "Oh, she's not my wife, she's my sister." And so Sarah became a concubine of the Pharaoh until such time God sent some serious diseases. And Pharaoh began to understand that what had happened was not a good thing. And he found out that Sarah was actually Abraham's wife. And so he sent them on their way with many gifts. At another stage in Abraham and Sarah's journey, doubt jostled belief because they'd been promised descendants. They'd been promised, Sarah and Abraham had been promised a son. But nothing seemed to be happening. So Sarah persuaded Abraham to sleep with one of her servant girls called Hagar. And as a result, Ishmael was born. And sometime later, when God told Sarah and Abraham that they truly would have a child of their own, they both laughed. They laughed at God. We're too old for this. There was this mixture of doubt and faith in relation to the promises of God. But in it all, through the ups and downs, and despite these lapses, they remained faithful to God in that overall sense. They continued the journey with God. And in Genesis 15:6, it says of Abraham, and we read from the Message translation again, and he believed. He believed God, and God declared him set right with God. And when Abraham's belief and faith in God was tested, when God instructed Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac, Abraham was willing to obey. And of course, God stayed his hand, Abraham's hand, and Isaac lived. Ultimately, not the security back in Haran could divert them, nor famine, nor fear of Pharaoh, nor the lack of a child, nor lack of land that they could call their own. None of these things led Abraham and Sarah to turn their back on God. And there's so much we can learn from this example of faith. But I want to finish this morning, not with Abraham and Sarah and their faith, but with God and his faithfulness to them. Like us, Abraham and Sarah were sinful human beings, but in it all, God remained faithful to his covenant promises to them. We read in Genesis chapter 15 that God came to Abraham in a vision and said, "Do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward." Do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward. Sisters and brothers, what wonderful words for us at Knightsbridge Baptist Church in the 21st century. God is our shield. He is our reward. We need not be afraid. As God calls us to whatever journey he calls us to individually and as a church, God has got so much more for us as individuals and together as the people of God. Shall we respond in faith to the God who journeys with us on every leg of the journey. Amen.